All right, we're moving on from last week. We'll just kind of leave it at that because we're never going to be able to have a full grasp of the age because we live in this age. And Paul, while he does paint a picture of what it's going to be like at the consummation of the age, which is a word for two coming together to become one, right? That should make sense to us in a graphic imagery. At the consummation of the age, when they are united, we can't really figure out the steps, the timeline, and all that stuff. We'll talk a little bit about theories of eschatology, theories of the end times, way later in the class. But for now, we haven't even got to the question of who is Jesus, which I've said is pretty foundational. So that's where we're going to be. And just in case you're at all rattled by last week, here's what you should know. God wins. And if we're in Christ, we win with him. That's what matters. And so in this age, Paul is saying, like, that's going to come, but what you need to do now is live like that's already your reality. Because if you are in Jesus, it actually is your reality in heaven, which is a little bit trippy to think about. So, last week, the beginning, we talked about the book of Acts, the understanding of who Jesus was from the book of Acts. Do you guys remember the two titles that Peter puts on him in his first sermon? Oh. Yeah, Lord, yep, and Messiah, that's right. So he is both, according to Peter, in public proclamation, the one who is to come to fulfill all of Israel's promises and become king again, that's the Messiah understanding, but then also in a way that wrecks everybody's world. He's Lord, which is another way for saying his name equals the name of God. In some trippy sense, Jesus and Yahweh are one, which is just berserk. And we're going to talk about that more today. And then we moved into Paul. That was the crazy off-track, two spheres becoming one, because Paul is all about how his understanding of how the end times is going to play out affects how we live today. You can think of it this way. The primary title that Paul wants to talk about with Jesus is that he is the king. He is the Lord of the world. When you read Colossians, it's this whole like, who is Jesus? He's the Lord of the universe. And so what do you do to the Lord of the universe? You bow. If Jesus is king, that affects how you live the world. You don't just get to deny the claims or expectations of a king. That's not how kings work. And as 21st century people who live in democracies, we love to have our own free will and decisions and be able to push back against our governing authorities. That's not the New Testament world. And that's not how Paul describes the rule and reign of Jesus. You don't question the king. You do what the king wants, which is a little bit squirrely. So Paul's main question is, if Jesus is king of the world, how do we live in the world today? Knowing that Jesus is enthroned in heaven. And we're in the already, but not yet. One day he's coming back. He's going to rule the whole thing the way we all want and yearn for. That our bodies are even calling out for, that all creation is groaning for. But how do we live today? And this played out really practically for him. Because we live in a world where Christianity and Judaism feel pretty separate. That's not Paul's world. All the first Christians, who were they? Jews. I mean, at least in massive large part. You might say there's a few people who aren't Jews, like God-fearers like Cornelius, or the Ethiopian eunuch. There are a few outliers, but by and large, they're Jews or they're Samaritans who come from the Jewish bloodline. So the main question that the New Testament authors are grappling with, when the mission goes from Jerusalem through Judea and Samaria and into the ends of the world, is what does it look like to graft people into the reality that Jesus is king? This is really practical for them. How does a new convert start to follow Jesus? What would you say?
Believe, confess.
Yeah, right. And that's the Pauline understanding, right? Confess with your mouth and believe in your heart that Jesus is Lord, right? He's really clear in Pauline soteriology, which is the theological term for what it means to be saved, the process by which God makes us look more like Jesus. There's two things. You have faith in Jesus, and you're baptized into Jesus. These are two hallmarks, faith and baptism in Paul. But Paul And that understanding is pushing back against a New Testament reality. Because the real concern was not our concern, which is, can you become a Christian through works, or is it just through faith, right? That was the Reformation question, and that's a question we still grapple with today. In Paul's world, the question was, do you have to become a Jew before you can become a Christian? Because Jesus is king of who? The Jews. And if he is the same as Yahweh, then wouldn't we want people to learn what it means to follow Yahweh? And Paul's expecting baptism. Well, baptism existed as a rite already for people who were not Jews to get baptized into Judaism and take on a new set of expectations. So our question is, can you be saved by faith alone? And Paul's question in his world was, do you got to be a Jew before you can be a Christian? That's just a separate thing. So when you're reading Paul, you can understand that's the concern he's dealing with, and that's framing what goes on. Do you need to be a Jew first? Paul's answer, yeah.
When do you think that shift happens, that when they were hearing this, it was berserk to them to hear that Jesus is God, and we don't think much of that.
Yeah.
So in history, where do you think that shift happened?
Yeah, so it happens pretty early on in Greek theology, which we're actually talking about very extensively next week. So it's really, really quick. Today is really the final opportunity for us to see the different ways New Testament authors are raising this concern and question. But within
culture that fast.
I mean, within 200 years. And there's a reason. It's because like the gospel message was captivating to a world, and it spread like crazy, especially in the Roman world. And for reasons we'll also talk about that don't have anything to do with theology, have a lot to do with practical stuff. Yeah, and also not just Roman infrastructure, but also just the way Christians behaved. So if you want to read a book, by the way, to describe the rise of early Christianity, it's a really good book. It's by Rodney Stark. I think it's actually called The Rise of Christianity, but you might have to look that up. His main contention is that the reason Christianity spread throughout the world didn't really have much to do with whether or not people said the right things or worshiped the right way. It had to do with the fact that whenever there was a crisis in the Roman world in the first couple centuries, all of the upper class people who were supposed to have the average Joe citizens back left. When there was disease, they all fled to their villas in the country. When there were fires, they just blamed it on other people and never helped rebuild. When infants were dying in trash humps, the intellectual elite said, that's fine, that's like where they should be. And what did Christians do? They rescued babies from dumpsters, essentially. That when everybody else fled during plague, they opened their houses to people who were sick and died. And a lot of them actually got sick and died as well. But that was their practical application. When Jesus says, carry your cross and follow me, they're like, well, that means that I shouldn't let someone suffer and die on the street if I've got a place to take care of them and wash their feet. And so Christians became nurses in the Roman world. And you know what happened? All those people who survived became Christians. And so did their entire family. Because when no one else cared, they cared. Which is why Jesus says, I think it's Matthew 13, if I've got it in my brain correctly, like, when you serve them, you serve me. Are you caring for the widows? Are you caring for the sick? It was very practical. And so they did that. When the world was falling apart, Christians moved to Rome rather than ran away. And it became a global phenomenon. So what might that mean for us today in the ways that we ignore social issues? Like they always leaned in. And it wasn't about theology or politics. It was just Jesus says serve people. And so when I serve people, I'm serving him. So what am I going to do? I'm going to serve the weak and the vulnerable who need my help. And the church exploded. So great question. Really early on. We're going to talk extensively about it next week. I'm actually really excited about it. It's just such a fun concept. But today, jumping back on track briefly, Paul is going to push back on this narrative of you have to be a Jew first. And you can see this in the book of Acts. We recently did a sermon series on it. Whenever you read it, it's this hard line of like, do we associate with people who aren't Jews? How can Gentiles really follow Jesus? What does that look like? That's a tension through the book of Acts, which Paul largely resolves in most of his writings. He says, no, you don't got to be a Jew. Just believe in Jesus and get baptized. and start living like you're in this new kingdom reality that's coming one day. But today, we're out of Acts, we're out of Paul, and we're jumping back in history with later written texts, which is a little bit trippy. So the Gospels are going to tell us the story of Jesus that Paul largely wasn't even a part of because he came in kind of late to that vision. He didn't walk and talk with Jesus except on the road where he got blinded by a resurrected Jesus. But they come later because by and large, for the first 30 or 40 years, the word of mouth is what spread the Christian vision and stories of Jesus. And there was a codified, like, these are stories that should be told. But eventually it becomes so big, so vast, and out there. You've got different competing visions for who Jesus is that gospel writers said, we should really probably write this stuff down so that people have a source of authority that they can go back to. Rather than just trusting infallible humans, people who were there, witnessed this stuff, or got their story from direct witnesses, started to write it down. And they have a different set of questions, which is important. So I want to tell you, today, gospel in Greek means good news. So that's not something that's super profound, but what it means in praxis is another Greek word called charisma. And this is what mattered in the world, because it's not just the good news of Jesus up in some book pushed on a shelf. This means the good news of Jesus proclaimed, that which is taught and told. The story of Jesus that's shared over coffee with somebody else, proclaimed from pulpit, taught in the class. That's the charisma, the good news. And we get the proclamation of who Jesus is and what he's done primarily from the written account in the Gospels. And they are going to ask two questions and answer one of them. And then leave us to answer the other, which is a little bit challenging. Here are the two questions. I'm giving them up front. We're not going to keep it secret. They're going to ask us, who does Jesus think he is? And then who do you think he is? Who does Jesus say that he is? And who do you say that he is? And all three of what's called the Synoptic Gospels are going to ask us this question. Anybody know what the term synoptic means, or what I'm even referring to? You don't have to.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Yeah, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the word synoptic sounds hard, but it just comes from the word synopsis, which means you can distill it into kind of like one little thing. And so Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar in many ways that the story can be shared in one synopsis. So we get the synoptic gospels, whereas John is off doing something completely different. And we'll talk extensively about him as well today. So first, we are going to hit a hallmark story that happens in all three gospels. It's in Matthew chapter 16, it's in Mark chapter 8, and the one that we're going to read today is in Luke chapter 9, verses 18 through 20. This is that crazy moment in Caesarea Philippi where Jesus turns to his disciples and says, who do you think that I am? Who is reading this? Josh.
Once when Jesus was praying in private and his disciples were with him, he asked them, who do the crowd say I am? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago has come back to life. But what about you? He asked. Who do you say I am? Peter answered, God's Messiah.
Great. So there's a number of things I want to unpack about this story, and it happens in slightly different terms in each of the Gospels, the kind of same synopsis. Matthew adds this line, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Luke, I think in the Greek, the way it's ordered is, you are the Messiah sent from God, however you want to say it. Then Mark leaves all that stuff out. It just says you're the Messiah. You can see how they kind of build on each other over time. Mark was written first, and Matthew was like, well, we need to give that a little bit more context. And then Luke is like, maybe I'm going to change it up just a little bit, as he writes his a little bit later. So what we have going on here is Jesus' question, who do you say I am? Which the authors of the New Testament are still asking you today. That's a multiple millennia old question, still relevant, very relevant to your spiritual life in this moment. And Peter's answer is, you are, the Christ, which is the Greek word for Messiah. Hebrew is Messiah, Greek is Christos, the Christ. And also the Son of God. Do you remember Peter's two things that he said about Jesus in Acts again? You are the Messiah and L-O-R-D, Lord, which we came to. Remember the equals this and this, and the same thing as Yahweh and Jesus. He's saying Yahweh and Jesus are kind of the same name, the name of the Lord. So most people, when they read the Gospel of Matthew, because this is where we get this specific line, a lot of pastors are going to preach. Peter, all the way back in Matthew, what is this, 16, is able to say, Jesus is God. Well, let me tell you, that's actually not what this says at all. That is what Peter is saying with Jesus being Lord, but Son of God is a Greek and Hebrew idiom referring back to the Davidic dynasty. What Matthew is suggesting here in Peter's announcement is you're the one who is to come, who is going to be our king again. David was called the Son of God. David's sons who became kings were called sons of God. The Messiah who was to come was supposed to be the Son of God, not in the theological sense of a pre-existent being of the same essence and substance as the Father. That's a later theological development. But one who is coming in the line of David to fulfill God's promise. So this line is left out of two of the gospel records, in part because it's really still saying this. And this is actually confusing for modern readers. Because you'd think Peter is saying that Jesus is God. No, he's not. Not yet, at least. And Jesus is really clear about this, because if this was the case, he wouldn't have said what comes next. This messianic title is insufficient for Jesus. Peter says, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And what does Jesus say? The Son of Man. He kind of rejects this title and instead says this. Must suffer many things and die. And what does Peter say? No, that's not how this works. How are you going to be the king like David, the Son of God that I'm talking about, if you're going to instead be this, the Son of Man who suffers? So here we have an allusion back to the Davidic dynasty. Here we have a direct reference from Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 7, there is this Son of Man coming down on the clouds from heaven to judge the world. What is Jesus saying about himself when he calls himself the Son of Man? He's not saying, I'm just like you guys, an everyday, ordinary human. He's saying, I'm not just the king who's coming to fill the promises of the Old Testament. I am God himself who's one day going to come down from heaven and judge you guys. So that's trippy, right? Son of Man actually means Jesus' deity. Son of God means he's a man out of the line of David. That's confusing. But they would have got this stuff. And we learn that they get this stuff, actually, because there's a trial that happens where the same language is used. And it really screws things up. What do I want to say? Yeah. Well, we'll go ahead and... No. Sorry. I gave somebody, I think, the passage from Luke 9, 28 through 36, right? Who's got that? I'm going to stop talking. You read that, and we'll see how this plays out.
About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. And while he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and did not tell anyone that at that time what they had seen.
So this is that really trippy story that's in all the Gospels. And there's actually a Transfiguration Sunday in the church year. It was last Sunday, I think. It could be this Sunday. That'd be trippy if we just happened to stumble upon it in the liturgical year. And when pastors encounter this text, I've preached on 2 versions of this text before. It's kind of like, what on earth do we do with this? Well, contextually, we read it with the profession that happened earlier in that chapter. We're just a few lines away from when Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "Well, you're the Messiah, sent from God." And he's like, "That's not enough. I'm more than that. I am the Son of Man." And it doesn't kind of hit them right away. You know what does? A few days later, they go up a mountain with Jesus. And they're sleepy and tired because they've hiked. Anybody hiked a mountain? You're like, what do you want to do? Just sit down for a little bit. But then all of a sudden there's this cloud of glory and Jesus is transfigured before their eyes and they look at him and they're like, "Ah!" Like, what is happening? Their Old Testament heroes are standing next to him and he's looking he's like in the middle and he's dazzling and you can barely even look at him. It says the glory of the Lord shines from him. There's nobody else in biblical literature from whom the glory of the Lord shines. What is the text saying? Jesus says, "This is who I say I am, let me show you." And he goes up a mountain. And these disciples who couldn't grasp this and were only concerned about this, freak out. Because they're having to, in that moment, experientially deal with this question that everybody else is going to have to deal with a little bit later when it starts getting pronounced. What does it mean that Jesus is God? Like, what does it mean that we've been walking around with this guy who we thought was the Messiah and an amazing teacher who's always pushing us, but now we see he's not just that, he's the God of the universe? Wouldn't you start thinking through, like, man, I wish I wouldn't have said that to the God of the universe? How am I gonna sit down and eat with this guy moving forward? This is just radical moment, which is almost always just skipped over in Christian teaching. Jesus is saying, I'm not just going to tell you, I'm going to show you. And let me show you also how these titles work with some biblical scholars who encounter Jesus a little bit later. Who has Matthew chapter 26, verses 59 through 68? Go for it.
Inside, the leading priests and the entire high council were trying to find witnesses who would lie about Jesus so they could put him to death. But even though they found many who agreed to give false witness, they could not use anyone's testimony. Finally, 2 men came forward who declared, "This man said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Well, aren't you going to answer these charges? What do you have to say for yourself?" But Jesus remained silent. Then the high priest said to him, "I demand, in the name of the living God, tell us if you're the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus replied, "You've said it, and in the future you will see the Son of Man seated in the place of power at God's right hand, and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes to show his horror and said, "Blasphemy! Why do we need to hear another witness? You have all heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict?" "Guilty," they shouted. "He deserves to die." Then they began to spit in Jesus' face and beat him with their fists, and some slapped him, jeering, "Prophesy to us, you Messiah. Who hit you that time?"
Here again, we see the insufficiency of calling Jesus simply Messiah and Son of God, which they knew full well meant the next returning king in David's line. In this moment, Jesus is accused of saying he's the Messiah. That's enough to make him mad. And what do they say? In the name of the living God, answer. And I find that hilarious. Why? Because they're talking to the name of the living God. The one who Peter, shortly after, when he stands up in front of a group, is going to say, you killed him, God raised him, say you're sorry. Jesus is Lord, which means Jesus is God. His name is the name under which we are saved and should testify. So it's like, in your own name, tell us who you are. It's kind of
It
silly.
always seemed like when that was happening that he was minimizing
Right.
who he was because it's reversed and you
Yeah.
never understood that.
Yeah, it's really, really helpful because they say, are you the Messiah? And he says, yeah, he says, you say so, great. And they're like, well, that's enough to kill you. And he's like, if that's enough to kill you, let me tell you who I really am. One day you'll see the Son of Man coming in judgment, who's been enthroned in heaven in the highest place. Who also says that, by the way? Peter in Acts chapter 2, that Jesus has been raised and is seated at the right hand of God the Father. Let me tell you who I really am. And they understand. They've been schooled in the scriptures. They know immediately that he's talking about Daniel chapter 7. And so what do? Blasphemy. Tears his clothes. This man is claiming to be God. Whoa. That's a revelation at this part of the gospel story. See, the Synoptics are trying to tell you about Jesus' life to just answer one question. Who is this man? Who is this guy? Who does he think he is? And then ultimately, who do you say that he is? That same question is asked of you today. Like reading this gospel, understanding who Jesus was, what he thought about himself, and how he lived his life. Who do you think he is? And that's the faith question that all of us have to answer to kind of be in him. So that's the story of the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They have differences, as we highlighted a little bit, but in general, it's one story that leads us here. The ultimate revelation that Jesus is not just Messiah, who is coming in the line of King David, but is the Son of Man, God himself, who's one day going to come back and judge all the people who stomp on his blood like it doesn't even matter. That is the charisma, the good news of the Synoptic Gospels. Now we move into John. And John, this guy, he read all this stuff and he said, that's all great. Let me tell you the story of the beloved disciple who was close to Jesus. You heard all these things about Jesus proclaimed from other people in crowds, but I want to share you the story, the conversations we had, the words that came out of Jesus' mouth when it was just us. You get this unique inside scoop. So, John is going to write a book based on his theological priorities. It's not like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, kind of semi-chronological. We're going to see Jesus in the temple way before the Synoptic Gospels say he's in there, for instance. But the question is going to be the same. Who does Jesus say he is, and who do you say he is? And we start with John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5.
Christ, the eternal Word, is the title of the section. In the beginning, the Word already existed. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He existed in the beginning with God. God created everything through him, and nothing was created except through him. The Word gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it.
Well, John just goes right to it. He said, you guys have read all the other stories where it holds off the punchline, the main point. I'm going to give it to you right up front. In the beginning was the Word, which is the Greek word logos, which is a Greek term that means reason or mind of the world. This was a way of talking to people who weren't just Jews to hit their understanding of who God was. So in the beginning, there was this truth, would be like a biblical way of understanding it. And he was with God, theos, and was God. We get Son of Man in terms that most of us can understand right off the bat. Everybody say, thank you, John. You're right. We don't have to be confused about man and God being inverse to each other. Instead, we get, from the very beginning, Jesus, before he even walked and talked on earth, walked and talked in the heavenly realms with God. That's a new theological development. And it's the first couple of lines of the gospel. We're not just talking about the Jesus who looks like us, who's born of the Virgin Mary, suffers under Pontius Pilate, is crucified, dead, and buried, and raised. We also get this concept of, well, for him to have been God and looked like us, that means he would have had to be God in essence before he took on human essence. And this is where we get to the doctrine of the incarnation. How does God become man? And theologians are going to spend like 2 centuries trying to discuss this. And then ultimately they have to have this gathering of all of the churches at this place called Chalcedon, or Chalcedon, however you want to pronounce it, where they have to make some definitive statements because nobody can quite figure this out. No surprise. How does God become man? Can you tell me? No. We'll talk about the way that different people have before, but right off the bat, rather than at the end of the story, we get this articulation. Jesus is God. And he isn't just God in a sense that some people wanted to talk about. There were conflicting views with the Gnostics of the day where Jesus becomes God, is adopted into godhood because of the way he lives his life. Like the way that he perfectly displays God's vision for a human to live makes him God in the end. John's like, no, that's garbage. This guy was God before he came. And that's why we know we can actually be saved and have a pathway back to God. So right off the bat, Jesus is the divine reason who's with God and equal to God and somehow is going to become incarnate. Crazy stuff. But then, you guys probably know, the Gospel of John is where we also get the famous I am statements. So if we're wondering who Jesus thinks he is, it might be appropriate to listen to some of the things that he says about himself. I am the blank. Okay? So here's a critical one. We're not going to cover all of them. We just don't have time. We're already running out of time. But who had John chapter 11, 25 through 27? Great, thank you.
Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this? She saith unto him, Yea, Lord, I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world.
Wonderful. Now you guys are experts. You've heard this language, Son of God, Messiah, and Christ before. What is, well, collectively, Mary and Martha, what are they saying about Jesus? We believe that you are the Messiah who was to come to be the next king of Israel. It sounds like, to modern readers, we believe that you're the one who's going to come and set all things right, who is God himself, but that's not what's happening. You're the one who's to come to fulfill the promises, and you're going to take the seat of David, and that's why she's mourning. Because can an earthly king resurrect the dead? Oh, see, now we're getting to it a little bit. Jesus says, why are you freaking out? I told you I was going to come. And I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me won't perish, right? So why are you freaking out? Don't you believe in me? She says, yeah, Jesus, I trust you. I believe with all my heart you're the one who is to come, who's going to be the king of the world. And what does Jesus do? He weeps. Why? Not just because his friend is dead, but because his other friends are mourning unnecessarily because they don't understand who he is in his fullness. Not just the Son of God who's going to be the king of the world, but the Son of Man, the one who actually has power over life and death itself. Who has power over life and death? None but God. So what does he do? Knock, knock, Lazarus, come on out. Someone take off his clothes. He can't breathe in there, right? And resurrects him from the dead and everybody's like, what is going on? Because they don't have a way to conceptualize how the Messiah can do this stuff. That's what's going on here. Messiah is right, but it's insufficient. All the Gospels are asking, who is Jesus? The resounding answer is, he is the one who's coming to fulfill God's promises. But he's not just that. Who is coming to fulfill God's promises? God himself. And that changes everything about the story and everything about how we're supposed to live. And one place we see this painfully evident, where Jesus doesn't hold anything back, is in John chapter 14, verses 6 through 11. Who has that one? Josh.
Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Philip said, Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. Jesus answered, don't you know me, Philip, even after I have been among you for such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and that the Father is in me? The words I say to you do not speak on my own authority. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least believe on the evidence of the works themselves. Very truly, I tell you, whoever believes in me will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father, and I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. You may ask me for anything in my name, and I will do it.
So the context here is Jesus is telling his disciples, hey, I don't have a lot of time with you. I got to go back to where it came from, which was in heaven with God. And they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. We ain't prepared for that. We have no idea what it looks like to live for you in this world. We haven't seen it modeled enough. And he's like, you got this. I promise you got it. And they're like, no, we don't. Anybody feel like that? Like, I don't got it. So what do they want? They say, just show us the Father, and then we'll be able to fully trust you and feel like we're going to be okay. And what's his response? You guys have been hanging out with me this whole time. Don't you realize if you've seen me, you've seen him? Which must have been a trippy reality. Now, who understands that? Those who went up on the mountain. But that was just a couple. Everybody else was like, come on, how are we supposed to trust you? He says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. Now, that is a trippy concept. I'll illustrate it like this. Ancient Judaism is, in the study of religion, most people who study religion say the Jews created an entirely new way to think about God, and that was called monotheism. I before E. Nope.
Not in this one.
Not in this one. I can't spell, guys. It's crazy. I'm going to get a PhD and I can't spell. I have spell check. And Grammarly. Monotheism. Anybody know what this word means?
One God.
One God, yeah, right. Mono, one, theism, understanding of God. So God is one. And this is something that they didn't just believe in abstract theological terms. They practiced it. Every day they prayed a prayer from Deuteronomy chapter 6. It says, it's called the Shema. What does it say? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Great. So they invented monotheism, supposedly. It's actually not that simple, but we don't have time to talk about monolatrous henotheism, which is the technical term for what they did. I'm going to draw two circles again. I'm in the circle mood. So, the way that Jews during the day of Jesus wanted to think about Jesus is to say, we've got the name of the Lord over here, and then we've got Jesus over here. We know who he is. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We don't really know who he is. Well, what does Jesus come along and do? He says, if you've seen him, you've seen me. If you've seen me, you've seen him. I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. That is a mix of essences that should not happen. What that looks like is not two separate circles, but actually two concentric circles who have some overlap. Now, this is really bad theology, okay? We're going to clear that up next week. Don't panic. But what on earth does this mean? How is there one if there's two? How is there two if there's one? What is the overlap that Jesus is suggesting because he is in the Father and the Father is in him? It's going to be more overlap than this as we clear this up, but at minimum, there's some overlap. Jesus is saying that explicitly. How can there be overlap? And the ancient Jewish believers around them who know their scriptures cannot conceptualize of a world in which Jesus can be God. Why? Because there already is one. So at best, we've got multiple gods, people would suggest. Jesus and the Father, and then later the Spirit. So some people accuse Christianity as being tritheistic. You're really worshiping three gods, but that's not even remotely what the scriptures tell us, and that's not even remotely how people want to deal with this concept theologically. But next week, we get to dive into it. Aren't you excited? I actually find it exciting because it's very technical and trippy, and we get to just experience that together. For now, the question is, who does the New Testament say Jesus is? It says he's God. How are you going to respond to that? And one answer to that question, intellectually, should be, well, I got to figure out what on earth that means. Well, Christian theologians have been trying to do that for 2,000 years. We get to enter into that story with the concept of the Trinity next week. Anybody have any questions as we wrap it up? I know I just fire hosed you. All right, if not, let's pray. And I'm going to dismiss you. And next week you get to come and bathe in the theological playground of Trinitarian theology.